Hola, buenas tardes a todos. I'm Patricia Mazzei, the Miami Bureau Chief for the New York Times. Welcome to our event today, and thank you for joining us. Latino voters make up about 32 million eligible voters this year, making them the largest minority voting bloc in the nation. They're concentrated in a handful of states like California and Texas, and crucially also in the swing states of Arizona and Florida, which is where we are today. But while they tend to vote Democratic, the support is not monolithic. Almost 30% voted for President Trump in 2016, which is a statistic that I think we often fail to talk about enough. So what might happen this year? What are the issues that motivate the diverse Latino population? And are there interests that unite them and might lead to more political power for Latinos in the future? So here to discuss this today with me are Jorge Ramos, the anchor for Noticiero Univisión and a contributing op-ed writer for the New York Times, and former Congressman Carlos Curbelo, a Republican who represented Florida's 26th district until 2018. For our audience, please note that this event is being recorded. We've been reading some of the questions and comments that you've sent us, thank you. But if new ones occur during the conversation today, you can send them to us using the Q&A function with Zoom. I'll try to mix them into our talk as we go. So let's get started. I want to start with the fact that every single election cycle, we have this conversation about the growing power of the Latino vote, given how many more Latinos there are in the US each year. And then after each election, a lot of the times we find ourselves asking why the Latinos did not vote or perform at the level that they could have given their numbers. So I wanted to start off with what, if anything, is different this year. And Jorge, let's start with you.
Well, let me start by saying that what continues to be the same is what I call the Christopher Columbus syndrome. It's like every 4 years, they rediscover us. They love Latinos. Candidates start speaking Spanish or just saying a few words. And then for the next 3 years, they forget completely about us. And that's been happening so much that we're used to that. We're used to Ronald Reagan saying buenos dias or just a few words in Spanish, and then George W. Bush trying exactly the same thing. He was the first US president who thought that he spoke Spanish. And then now we have both candidates talking about Latinos. So that remains exactly the same. What's different are the numbers. I think the Latino community, we're going from big numbers to power. And that means, as you mentioned, for the first time, we are the largest minority bloc in the United States when it comes to voting. 32 million Latinos will go to the polls. And the real tragedy is that maybe only half of them, about 16 million, will actually vote. In 2016, the same thing happened. There were 27 million Latinos eligible to vote. And 13 million, imagine that, 13 million Latinos who had the opportunity to vote decided to stay home. We can analyze all that you want what happened, but maybe some Latinos felt very uncomfortable with Donald Trump, with his racist statements, with saying that Mexican immigrants were criminals and rapists. Maybe they felt very uncomfortable with what he said on the Access Hollywood tape. Maybe they felt very uncomfortable just by telling the pollsters that they were thinking of voting for Donald Trump. Son los que yo llamo los trumpistas tímidos, or the shy Trumpers. And then on the other hand, Latinos remember that Barack Obama promised immigration reform in the first year. They remember that he deported more than 3 million undocumented immigrants, and they just didn't feel comfortable voting again for another Democrat. So I think that's the difference. The big difference right now, I think has to do with the numbers and with the expectation that more Latinos will go to the polls.
Carlos, what do you think?
Well, I agree with Jorge. The big news and the big story is that a record number of Latinos will vote in this election, and that's wonderful news for the community. That gets us closer to power, as Jorge said. But of course, the turnout rate will likely be the lowest of all the racial and ethnic groups in the United States. And that's the sad part. But without question, Patty, Latino communities in Florida and Arizona and Georgia are poised to be the difference makers in critical states. So although we do this every 4 years, I think there's a good reason why we do it, because there are Hispanic communities in key states that here in the state of Florida have made the difference in some important elections in the past, and that certainly could make the difference in this critical 2020 election. So I'm really just happy to be here with both of you, an honor for me to be with two great journalists to explore kind of what's motivating this community this year, and what is it that could give Trump or Biden the advantage with these voters.
I'm glad that you mentioned some of those states, actually, because I think what we've seen a little bit different this year is, for example, Spanish language campaign ads in different accents for different communities. So you will see accents with, you will see Puerto Rican accented political ads, or with a Colombian or Venezuelan accent, or a Mexican accent, geared at those different communities, and not just in Florida or Arizona, right? But at Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, for example. So I think maybe we should step back and discuss, what is the Latino vote? Should we even refer to it as the Latino vote? This is a dilemma that I have myself as a reporter covering this. It's not monolithic. So when we say the Latino vote, what do we mean?
Well, I do think that we can call it the Latino vote, or now the Latinx vote. I know that only 3% of Latinos feel comfortable with Latinx, but I do think that there's a Latino vote. When I first got here to the United States, 1983, it was quite easy when you were talking about Latino vote, because it was the Mexican vote, the Cuban vote, and the Puerto Rican vote. That's it. And now that you're mentioning accents, it's absolutely true. I can safely say that maybe I have my job because I have a Mexican accent. And back then, in the 1980s and the 90s, when Mexicans were the majority, or Mexican Americans were the majority, to have un acento mexicano, it was good. It was easier, and people felt comfortable with that. And I still remember some of my colleagues with different accents from Spain, Argentina, Chile, Nicaragua. It was a little more difficult. Nowadays, the same diversity that we're seeing in all the United States, remember in 2044, everyone is going to be a minority, everyone, is the same diversity that we're seeing with the Hispanic population. Mexican Americans are diminishing when it comes to the percentage of the Latino population. And we are seeing incredible mixes, beautiful mixes. My son, Nicolas, he's Puerto-Cuban Mexican American. And he's just a representative as my daughter, Paola, Mexico-Cuban American, and many other different combinations of the new Latino that is taking power right now. So I do think that there's a Latino power. And in the last, well, I would say in the last election, in every election, I've said that there's no White House without the Latino vote. And believe me, in this election, there's no one can make it to the White House without the Latino vote, including Donald Trump.
An audience member, Marcela from Indiana, had asked if the political views of Latinos might be influenced by the generation in which they're in the US. So those who have been in the US longer might be more inclined, for example, to support one ideology than another. And Carlos, obviously, you are always talking about the young Latino voters because you are one of them, and you were born in the US. So do you think that's the case? Do your parents and grandparents, were they more conservative than you are?
Well, the answer to that is yes. And my mom, if she was listening, which I hope she is, would certainly agree. But this kind of ties back to what we were just discussing, that it's not a homogeneous community. It's a minority group that includes a lot of diversity within the group. That's why campaigns are starting to recruit people with specific accents to read ads, right? And I think a lot of American politicians are starting to realize that different Latino voters are motivated in different ways. For sure, younger Latinos born in the United States are more assimilated. And we would expect that many of them would not feel as strong an attachment to the immigration issue as those who immigrated here themselves. And that's natural. I mean, in my view, anyone who comes from an immigrant family, which means pretty much everyone in the United States, should care about the immigrant experience, should be tuned into it, but we can understand that that will vary by degrees depending on whether someone was born here or not, or if they're second or third generation, obviously they're even more assimilated. This reminds me, Patty, and you've covered this a lot here in South Florida, people would come to me and say, well, younger Cuban Americans are more liberal than their parents on the Cuba issue. And I would say, really, it's not that they're more liberal, it's just that most of them care about it less or aren't as attached to the old country as obviously people who fled the old country for a number of different reasons. So yes, I think especially on the Democratic side, politicians are starting to understand that you can't only talk immigration when trying to win Latino voters. You have to talk jobs and the economy. In South Florida, you have to talk foreign policy. In other words, the community, it looks a lot more like the rest of the United States than I think sometimes we perceive.
Let's talk about immigration, because in the past, it has been sort of the gateway issue, I think, for a lot of Latino voters, where even if it was not their number one issue, as you said, Carlos, they would see it as, if you speak to immigrants with a certain amount of respect and you acknowledge the contributions that we make to this country, then we will listen to you on the other issues, on the economy, on education, on healthcare and foreign policy. This cycle, though, especially compared to 2016, when President Trump made immigration such a centerpiece, immigration has really just hardly been talked about. Only in the past week, really, did we see in one of these town halls that an immigration question came up. So why is that? Jorge, I mean, do you think immigration is just not as big as an issue anymore?
I think it's a huge issue, but Carlos is right. Before the year 2000, the vast majority of the growth within the Hispanic community depended on immigration. Millions of immigrants were coming here every decade. There were about 1 million legal immigrants coming every year and about 1 million undocumented immigrants coming every single year. So the growth in the Hispanic community depended on immigration. But then 9/11 happened and things started to change. And now the vast majority of the growth within the Hispanic community comes from people being born in the United States. And that changes everything. Now, immigration, you're right, is not the most important issue for Latinos. We're just like the rest of America, exactly like the rest of America. We want exactly the same things. The Pew Center is very clear. What's the most important issue? Jobs. And right now it has to do with the pandemic. So we care about jobs, we care about healthcare, we care about education, and then immigration comes fourth or fifth place. However, immigration, when you talk about immigration with someone, it tells you, for a Latino, for an immigrant, who you are. It's a very important symbolic issue. So if you have Donald Trump and Joe Biden talking about immigration from completely different perspectives, they tell you exactly what's happening. And also we cannot forget that we have a huge problem that has to be resolved. And that is that right now in the United States, there are more than 10 million undocumented immigrants. 10 million undocumented immigrants who are part of the United States, who have contributed much more to the economy than what they take away from it. And there has to be a solution. We cannot have, in the most powerful and the richest country in the world, 10 million people who have no destiny. And I think we can change that. That's why I think immigration continues to be one of the most important issues symbolically. And that's why I think, for instance, Joe Biden has made 3 very important promises on immigration. And that's why I think Donald Trump is continuing with his idea of limiting legal and undocumented immigration and insisting on the idea that he wants to build his wall, that Mexico won't pay for that.
Sin embargo, Jorge, yo creo que este año el tema de la inmigración ha brillado por su ausencia, right? This is the the first election where climate change is a big issue, and it's also the first election in a few where immigration is not at the forefront. Y en mi opinión hay como que un pacto secreto entre las dos campañas para no hablar del tema. You have Donald Trump, whose rhetoric and policies have been so harsh that it's not just hurting him with Hispanics, but also with college-educated white voters in suburban America who are turned off by these policies. So he's not leading with the wall. He's certainly not leading with some of these child separation policies at the border. And then for the Democrats, you have this history of broken promise. I was watching a network this morning that reminded us, and by the way, it was not a conservative network, that reminded us, the viewers, that Barack Obama was dubbed the deporter-in-chief, and that immigration reform never happened. So it is kind of remarkable to me that this issue is still not resolved, clearly, yet it is not being discussed in a prominent way this year.
Jorge, you sounded like you were trying to say that this could be a vulnerability for both Biden and Trump, the immigration issue for Trump because of the wall, now that he's bringing it back among some of the Latino voters, that could be an issue, but also for Biden that he might be asked about the Obama deportations. We actually had a question from Becky in Texas who said, why would a Biden presidency would it be any different in terms of the number of deportations? Do you think that's sort of an Achilles heel, or does Biden have bigger issues to worry about?
Yeah, you're right. Democrats have a Latino problem. There's no question about it. And it has to do with the promises that they made and with the fact that Barack Obama, like it or not, and he hated that we reminded him that, he deported more than 3 million undocumented immigrants. Think about it, more than 3 million undocumented immigrants. So Joe Biden, I had an interview with him last February in Las Vegas, and he told me it was a big mistake. And they were very late to recognize that they had made a mistake. And they corrected it in 2012 when Barack Obama, with an executive order, gave us DACA and the protection for 800,000 Dreamers, that protection from deportation and the possibility of working in this country. And now Joe Biden has made, again, he recognized in that interview that he made a mistake, and he has made 3 promises. On a tweet, he said that in his first day, he is going to introduce immigration reform, a bill with immigration reform to legalize 10 million undocumented immigrants. That's big, because Barack Obama promised that he was going to do it in the first year. He didn't do it in 2009. And now here comes Joe Biden saying, I'm going to do it in the first, not the first week, but in the first day. So I guess January 21st is going to be a pretty busy day. Then he says that he's going to protect the Dreamers, first with an executive order, and then being part of immigration reform. That's the second promise. And the third promise is that he's going to give TPS, or immigration protection, to the Venezuelans living in the United States. Those are the 3 promises that Joe Biden has made to the Latino community. On the other hand, we have Donald Trump, who is probably the most anti-immigrant president that we've had in half a century, since Operation Wetback, when they deported more than 1 million Mexicans back to Mexico. He continues with his racist comments, he's responsible for the horrible separation policy at the border, where thousands of children were separated from their parents. He continues with the idea of putting immigrants and children in cages. So the difference, it's incredibly clear.
You know, we have a question from Beatriz in Georgia, and she asks, ¿hay diferencias entre el voto latino, femenino y el masculino? Que creo que es una pregunta interesante porque mi colega Jennifer Medina hizo una nota en Arizona sobre el machismo y los hombres latinos que apoyan a Trump. Y no sabía si ustedes lo han visto aquí en Florida o en tus viajes reportando, Jorge, pero ¿qué podemos decir sabiendo que en todas las encuestas el ex vicepresidente Biden tiene mayor apoyo entre las mujeres que los hombres y que eso entre los latinos parece ser igual?
Bueno, eso no queda la menor duda cuando tienes a un candidato como Donald Trump, que en el video de Access Hollywood dice que puede agarrar a las mujeres de sus genitales solo porque él es una estrella. Desde luego que eso va a ocasionar el rechazo de muchas mujeres latinas y no latinas. Hace poco el presidente Donald Trump dijo que la candidata a la vicepresidencia del Partido Demócrata, la senadora Kamala Harris, era un monstruo. Son comentarios sexistas, son comentarios machistas, y eso explica perfectamente por qué más mujeres prefieren a Joe Biden que a Donald Trump. ¿Cómo es posible que una mujer que va a votar por el presidente Donald Trump acepte estos comentarios de su propio candidato a la presidencia? Eso me parece que son una de las principales razones por las que es muy difícil para muchas mujeres apoyar a Donald Trump. Ahora, si sacamos estos comentarios sexistas y machistas por parte del presidente Donald Trump, tenemos el tema del aborto. Durante las últimas semanas he estado conversando con varios líderes evangélicos y ellos creen que a pesar de los comentarios sexistas, racistas de Donald Trump, a pesar de las más de 20,000 mentiras que ha dicho de acuerdo con el Washington Post, el tema del aborto es uno que define a muchos votantes y no pueden, por una cuestión moral, votar por alguien que ellos creen va a apoyar el aborto. Entonces, si bien es cierto que la mayor parte de las mujeres latinas y mujeres empiezan a votar, a pensar en votar en contra de Donald Trump o a favor de Joe Biden, el tema del aborto sigue siendo uno que divide de alguna forma a la comunidad latina.
Carlos, do you think Republicans have made inroads with religious Latino voters, evangelicals and Catholics on the abortion issue? And more broadly, just because perhaps Democrats did not reach out to them as such a targeted subgroup over time. We had a question from Mirna in Massachusetts, who said if it's just about abortion, or is it or just among older Cuban Americans that the sort of religion issue makes them conservative? But I feel like this is something you've had some time to think about.
Certainly, Patty, while we're accustomed to seeing Democratic politicians in African-American churches here in the state of Florida, it's Republicans who tend to frequent the mega churches that are populated mostly by Hispanics. And Republicans have really made inroads with this community by emphasizing social issues. And by the way, not just abortion, which is a key issue. And to Jorge's point, I have come across a lot of women who say, yes, Donald Trump offends me with what he says, but I'm pro-life. And he's pro-life, and look at the judges he's appointed, and that's more important to me than anything else. But also on other issues like gay marriage, although that's for the most part an issue that's in the past, there are still a lot of churches that openly and consistently advocate against gay marriage, and some Republican politicians have been very shrewd at building relationships of trust with these voters by way of their churches, by visiting their churches, by getting everything but the endorsement of the pastors of these churches, who are very powerful, by the way. Another issue that, interestingly, is of greater and greater importance to Latino voters who are evangelicals is the president's Israel policy and the idea of defending Israel and of standing with Israel. That's also another issue that Republicans have used to make meaningful connections with Latino voters. And here in South Florida, these churches are really not majority Cuban American. You have a lot of Central Americans, a lot of Mexicans. So yes, it has helped Republicans reach beyond their natural constituencies.
I'm wondering, changing the subject a little bit, what effect, if any, you think the George Floyd protests in the start of the summer may have had on the Latino vote? We have seen President Trump deploy a law and order message in English, but also in Spanish, that has fluctuated down the ballot with other Republican candidates trying to appeal to Spanish-speaking voters. So is this something that might peel some more Latinos towards Republican candidates on the ballot? Or did it have the effect of making Latinos sort of learn more, empathize more with African Americans, perhaps because Latinos have also been, have had the experience with discrimination or brutality at the hands of the police?
It is a very similar experience. Racism and discrimination is being felt by millions of Latinos every single day. And so they do understand what's happening within the African American community, because it's a shared experience. Now, I think we can learn a lot from the African American experience as Latinos. And when they see what happened to George Floyd, and when they see what has happened to other African Americans, Latinos can easily say, I've been there. I mean, I've been stopped. I've been discriminated simply because of my accent, simply because of my last name, simply because of the way I look. But I'm not sure, Patty, if this is an issue that is going to make a Hispanic voter go to Joe Biden or go to Donald Trump. Now, we come from countries in Latin America that are facing corruption, violence, and definitely the idea of law and order might seem an interesting one and someone that you want to defend. But at the same time, I think that systemic racism within the Hispanic community and the racism within the Latino community is such a strong issue and emotion that I think that's more important than the message of law and order.
Yo creo que hay una falta de solidaridad entre las comunidades latinas y afroamericanas en Estados Unidos. And I actually think that maybe a month ago, when the protests were raging and where you did see a lot of images of looting and violence on television, I think that boosted President Trump with Latino voters. And I can tell you anecdotally, I had people come up to me at supermarkets and at different places saying, what's happening to this country? Aquí hay que mantener el orden, están destruyendo el país. And I think because a lot of Hispanic immigrants came from countries where they did suffer the consequences of a lack of law and order, that they identified with that, and that in Donald Trump, at least during that time, they saw someone who would keep them safe, who would keep the looting and violence out of their neighborhood. So I think that issue is far more complex. I think probably younger, more assimilated Latino voters are more likely to sympathize with the African American community and to build that sense of solidarity. I think for more recent immigrants, it's probably more difficult.
I wonder what you make, since we're in Miami and it's hard to ignore right now the sort of war on the airwaves and with the dueling caravans every weekend tying up traffic on the streets. Esta guerra fría del socialismo que estamos viviendo en Florida, this socialism message, I have written about it and reported on how political strategists see it as appealing not just to Latino voters to call somebody a socialist and say that you're not the socialist, but also to whiter voters, to white voters who feel, you know, that sort of callback to the Cold War. But it just seems like it's at a fever pitch. We actually had a question from one of our listeners about the topic of misinformation and disinformation in the Latino community. That was Javier from Minnesota and Josue from New Jersey. And a lot of the videos and messages that I've seen on WhatsApp and circulating on YouTube are about that socialism attack. Is that just geared at Cuban Americans in Miami? Or what are we talking about here? And why haven't Democrats found an answer to this after year of this being something that's been used against them in political campaigns?
I think Democrats were too late to recognize that this is affecting them. Because when they were saying Joe Biden is a socialist, Kamala Harris is a socialist, they were laughing because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they are not socialists. Just recently, Joe Biden said, I am the guy who defeated a socialist, talking about Bernie Sanders. And even when you're talking about socialism, with Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you're talking about a democratic socialism that you would find in Scandinavian countries, not in Cuba, Venezuela, or Nicaragua. It's something completely different. However, I still remember that Leonel Sosa used to tell me that Reagan once told him that Latinos are really Republican. They just don't know it. And what he really meant is that because of our values, when it comes to religion, when it comes to abortion, when it comes to family, and when it comes to socialism, we have to remember, and Carlos can speak more about that, but the experience of the exile community from Cuba, the exile community from Venezuela now, from Nicaragua, for them, socialism is not something abstract, it's real. I mean, they left their countries because of socialist policies. They left their countries because of socialist dictators. Right now we have a dictator in Venezuela. So I don't think that the attack on socialism is just, oh, Joe Biden is a socialist. No, what they really mean is that, and they remember, is that during the Barack Obama government, Barack Obama opened relationships with a dictatorship, with Cuba. They remember that. They remember that during the Barack Obama administration, the dry food, wet food policies disappeared. And Cuban Americans and Cubans who were able to come to this country, touch this country, and be protected, that stopped completely. So they still remember that in 2013, when Maduro became president and dictator in Venezuela, and during the fraudulent elections in 2014, that the Obama government didn't have a pretty aggressive policy against them. So that's what they remember, and that's why I think the socialism attack is hurting Democrats.
Without question, it's a potent attack. Socialism is a foul word in a lot of Latino families, and the Biden campaign was late to understand the significance of that attack. I do give them credit. I think in recent weeks, this response of I defeated the socialist in the Democratic primary has been effective and has given some comfort to especially some younger Latino voters who maybe don't like Donald Trump, but did inherit from their parents that skepticism, if not fear, of socialist ideas. And Patty, I think you and I have talked about this before. In communities like South Florida, it really brings together and does create a sense of solidarity between Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Colombians who fled the FARC and consider that part of the Latin American socialist movement. So I think Democrats, not just for this election, but after this election, they have to do a lot of work to explain what Jorge just did, which in politics, if you're explaining, it usually means you're at a disadvantage, but that they are not the party of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that they are, sure, a center-left party, but certainly that they would never welcome the types of ideas or attitudes or people that are involved in governments like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other parts of this hemisphere.
Yeah, you're right. We call it the Cuban spillover effect. Go ahead, Jorge, I'm sorry.
No, that party explains what you asked right at the beginning of the conversation. How do you explain that 28% of Latinos, 28%, that is about 3.5 million Latinos who voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And the last poll that we did at Univision, Donald Trump had about 24% of the intention from voters, Latino voters. So that means more than 3 million Latinos still want Donald Trump to be president. And we have to ask why. Partly it has to do with what we've discussed, with that immigration is not the most important issue for some of them. Partly has to do with the idea of abortion. Partly has to do, again, with the idea of socialism, that there's no way that some Cuban American voters, some Venezuelan voters, some Latin American voters are going to vote for someone that they feel is more aligned with policies that they simply detest. So that explains that 28%.
I've seen some Democratic campaigns try to counter some of that by trying to call Trump a caudillo, by painting him as a strongman like the strongman that we have seen in Latin America. I have also seen polls by Democratic-leaning organizations like X Labs that suggest that that message doesn't really work for swing voters, that swing voters don't, sort of roll their eyes at that comparison. And what they really want to hear from Democratic candidates in this case is what they think of issues, what they think about healthcare, about education, about foreign policy. Having said that, it seems like an inescapable sort of parallel that we've seen this campaign season. And we have a question from Federico to you, Carlos, who asks, how can conservative Latinos listen to the president call into question the peaceful transfer of power, and say perhaps, not say clearly that he's going to accept a loss if he loses, and attack the free press, and not make sort of, not draw the line and connect the dots to authoritarians like Hugo Chavez and Maduro, who Trump compares to Biden, right? So do we find ourselves in this sort of surreal world where Latin American politics are comparisons are infiltrating politics in the US?
Well, Patty, I don't want to generalize, but in talking about an entire community, it's a bit hard not to. But here's my progression, right? Clearly, in Latin America, over many years, caudillos have been successful. A lot of countries are led by caudillos or by caudillo-type leaders, even if they're democratically elected and follow the rules of their constitutions. So it shouldn't be a major surprise that some Latinos in the United States have a degree of tolerance for caudillismo, for this strongman type leadership. And I've heard many people, some people who are friends of mine, say, yeah, he said that, but what I care about is jobs and the economy and keeping taxes low, and therefore I'm willing to tolerate some of these, what I consider to be very dangerous statements. I mean, my family, Patty, your family, in many ways is in this country because people did not follow the rules of the democracies that existed at one point in Cuba and in Venezuela. So for me, that's a big alarm goes off in my head when someone says that they may not recognize the result of an election, or that they may not allow there to be a transfer of power. For a lot of Hispanic voters, it's okay as long as the person agrees with them. It is a pragmatism that is excessive in my view, because there has to be a line somewhere. And that's why I think you see not just a lot of Latino voters, but a lot of voters in general in the United States excusing some of Donald Trump's statements and at times actions that are a threat to what we call in Latin America el orden democrático, the constitutional order. It's difficult to hear sometimes, but I really do think that there is a degree of tolerance for caudillismo, for strongman type leadership in Hispanic communities.
I don't know if it's my immigrant spirit, but I so completely trust the system, Carlos, that I don't think that we will ever see a dictatorship in the United States. Maybe it's just my immigrant.
Que Dios te oiga. Que Dios te oiga.
But something interesting, Patty, also is that we Latin American journalists have been trained perfectly for Donald Trump, because we cover for so many decades caudillos and strongmen and dictators, people who attack the press, people who call us the enemy of the people, that suddenly, when Donald Trump came and when he ejected me from a press conference in 2015, said, oh, well, that's exactly that Fidel Castro did to me a few years before. So thanks to that, Latin American journalists, we've been trained to deal with Fidel Castro, and now with Donald Trump. I don't think, honestly, that we'll ever have a dictatorship in this country. I think Congress is incredibly strong. The Supreme Court is completely independent. That the press is still very strong. I don't see the conditions in the United States that would allow us to have a dictatorship like the ones that they're having right now in Cuba, in Venezuela, or in Nicaragua. I simply don't see it. I cannot see it. Of course, I think it's regrettable that the president Trump has said that, hasn't said that he will recognize the results of the election, of course, but it doesn't matter what he says. If he loses, I fully trust that the system will work.
We want to wrap up. There's been so many questions, and I want to thank our audience. So many good ones. A lot of them have been along the lines of how to empower Latino voters, either how to mobilize them or help older voters ahead of the election. But I want to end with asking your thoughts, circling back to what we discussed at the beginning, which was Latino power and this sort of underperformance of Latino voters historically. This is a question from Fatima, who asked, what can the Latinx community do to unite so that the new elected president doesn't forget about us? So it was kind of a forward-looking way to end this, so that in 4 years, we're not talking about the Latino vote underperforming again, or about promises broken, like you were referring to, Jorge, by whoever the next president is. Is there a way that the community can sort of make itself heard more, or is it just up to the elected leaders to not forget it into that Christopher Columbus effect that you mentioned?
I think that we've learned at the beginning, as we said, candidates would just say a few words and we say, oh, eso es fantástico, qué bueno, yo voy a votar por él. And then they started making promises, and now we've learned. Believe me, I think Joe Trump is very uncomfortable trying to defend a policy that deported 3 million undocumented immigrants. And he's very uncomfortable trying to defend a government that promised to give us immigration reform and didn't. So our vote, nuestro voto, is incredibly important. I know that some people believe that the last election in 2016, it was decided in Michigan and Wisconsin and in Pennsylvania. I don't think so. I think the last election was actually decided in Florida and Arizona. And by the way, the election in Florida and Arizona was decided by barely 100,000 votes. Remember, 30 million Latinos stayed home. So if the 29 electoral votes in Florida and the 11 electoral votes in Arizona had gone to another candidate, Donald Trump would not be president right now. So what I'm telling you again is the same idea. There's no White House without the Latino vote. And in this election, instead of 13 million Latinos actually voting, I'm guessing that about 16 million Latinos, probably 17 million Latinos, will actually go to the polls. And that's going to make a big difference. But we have to vote. That's our power. And again, we're going from big numbers to power, and we have to demonstrate to Joe Biden, to Donald Trump, and to all candidates that either you promise and you deliver, or on the last election, we're not going to vote for you.
Carlos?
Yeah, I think that's right, Patty. Power isn't given, it is recognized. And if Latino voters in the United States want to be recognized, they have to vote and they have to participate. And I think there's a model. The South Florida Hispanic community gets discussed a lot on national television shows, gets written about a lot in important newspapers like the New York Times. Why? Because it is a community where Latinos vote in very high numbers compared to other Latino communities, and also compared to their white and African-American peers. And that's why that community gets recognition. That's why that community is oftentimes credited with helping George W. Bush become president in the year 2000, because they participated, they organized, they made sure their voices were heard. That is how the community can lead, can grow, can produce leaders who can one day get elected to be president of the United States and to other positions of power. So no matter who you're voting for, I want to encourage everyone to go out there and participate, and that when the results come back, we see that Latinos may be voted at 60% instead of the expected 50% or 65%. If every other community can do it, we certainly can do it as well.
Well, and I would like to say, for those of us who are reporters, who are in the media, who are Latinos, I think we all, even nobody has to tell us, but we too have to keep reporting about these communities in between election years, which, every time there's more of us, we're able to really dive into the nuances and really show the sort of, texture of the country with all of us here. So thank you. Gracias, Jorge y Carlos. Gracias a todos ustedes por unirse a nosotros hoy. en nuestro primer programa bilingüe de New York Times. We hope you'll stay in touch. We have a weekly newsletter in Spanish called El Times for the best stories from the Times in Español that you can sign up for at nytimes.com/eltimes. And we will see you again soon. The election is in 2 weeks. Stay informed. Y buenas tardes.
Gracias.
Gracias.